Chapter 1. The First Proposal. "I can't believe what jackasses these guys are," one of my daughters texted. "I can't believe how short their pants are," I texted back. On a cold Midwestern winter night in 2020, my group chat with my two adult daughters was running hot. Only halfway into the evening's episode of The Bachelorette, we had already dissected everyone's personality and wardrobe choice. Although this was my first time following a son of the long-running reality dating franchise, I was starting to get a hang of the antics that ensue when a person searches for a soulmate on network TV. Of course, I had heard of The Bachelor and its many spin-offs before Tayshia Adams' quest for true love became appointment TV for me. I wasn't living under a rock. My interest in the show, however, had begun during a family visit to my daughter Jenny's house earlier that year. I had been surprised to discover that my son-in-law John, a real man's man, was a fan. My other daughter, Angie, Jenny, my granddaughters, and John were all gabbing about who had kissed whom, who they thought was the right pick, and who was the most immature man. Child of the bunch. All right, I thought, if John can watch a season of The Bachelor, so can I. In general, I'm a joiner. And when it comes to my family, I always want to be a part of the fun. This has never been more true than during the pandemic. When I was sequestered at home, my daughters were cautious and concerned about visiting because they didn't want to expose me to anything picked up at school or work. So our bachelor dates took on an outsized importance. It was one of the few things I had to put on my weekly calendar that I looked forward to. When The Bachelorette began airing in the fall of 2020, I began tuning in and texting with the girls. I don't know what I liked better. Satisfying moments like Bennett getting the smug expression wiped from his face when the phlebotomist from California sent Mr. Harvard home, or my daughter's candid wit and wisdom in a text thread about the show each week. While I was not too invested in the main purpose of the show, two people eventually finding a lasting match, it did remind me of my soulmate and the fact that she was no longer by my side. Whenever I saw a gleam of excitement in a contestant's eye or an authentic embrace, my chest grew heavy. These images of new love reignited the loneliness I felt after the passing of my wife, Toni. Mostly, though, it was a point of connection with my daughters. By the winter, I had a real feel for the show and was giving Angie and Jenny's trash talking a run for their money. At the end of the episode we were watching on that winter night, the network flashed a message to seniors looking for love. A request for candidates for the part of the senior bachelor had run repeatedly throughout the episode. We had been too busy trading snarky texts about the contestants on the show to comment earlier, but when the notice appeared on the screen right after the episode, Angie texted, "Dad, you should do that." Me? I got up from the couch and took a look at myself in the closest mirror. I was wearing a grubby old shirt and hadn't had a haircut in at least 6 weeks. My beard had grown scruffy. Aftershave? More like afterthought. Who in the hell would be interested in seeing this face on TV? I thought. Self-care wasn't exactly at the top of my to-do list. It had been nearly 3 years since I'd lost the love of my life, and I didn't feel all that far along in the grief process. It's hard to move on after 43 years of a wonderful marriage, especially when the two of you had been together since you were teenagers, like Toni and me. In 1969, I was a senior at Walsh, a small Catholic high school in Ottumwa, Iowa. With only slightly over 300 students in the entire school, no one was a complete stranger. But I didn't get to know Toni, a junior, until I untiered to work on the high school play. I had zero interest in theater and was only there because of a girl. And that girl wasn't Toni. In fact, it was her best friend. Despite my best attempts at getting this girl's attention and a date, she had absolutely zero interest in me. But while moving scenery and sets backstage, Toni and I got to talking a little. On the face of it, we didn't have a lot in common. The class clown, most comfortable in front of a crowd, I was on the basketball, baseball, and debate teams. Artistic and seemingly shy, Toni had a circle of good friends she stuck close to. In the beginning, I had to work pretty hard to get that conversation started. Once it started, it was great. She had noticed me playing in basketball and baseball games, and I could feel myself growing, taller just knowing she had thought of me. It was exciting to have a girl interested in me, which I felt from the way she looked at me with her big brown eyes. Soon I was asking her to dances. We went together to almost every Friday night dance that year at the YMCA or the Ottumwa Coliseum. Some students from my grade had a band that, after playing a couple of our high school dances, graduated to the Coliseum, where they performed not only for the Catholic school kids but also for the public. We danced nonstop to covers of popular bands like the Beatles, the Monkees, and the Dave Clark Five. Toni, who had natural rhythm and confidence, was a very good dancer. I was more methodical, always counting in my head to the beat. I think I still do that when I try to dance. If Toni minded my plotting moves, she didn't show it. The best were the slow dances, when it felt like she was melting into me. When we danced at school, the nuns patrolling the floor to make sure there was enough space between. Partners singled us out more than once. Our relationship blossomed over the course of those dances, and by the following year, after I enrolled as a freshman at a local junior college, and Tony began her senior year of high school, we had tunnel vision for each other. Everyone else fell away. Neither of us could imagine being with anyone else. Because we were so young, our parents were a bit of an obstacle. Tony's parents turned out to be very supportive, but my mom was the opposite. A difficult woman with struggles of her own, my mother did everything she could to drive a wedge between Tony and me. She tried her hardest to matchmake her between, play, another high school student and me, going as far as talking to the girl, was mother frequently about what a great couple we'd make. When that didn't work, she tried to prevent me from seeing Tony. On days when she knew we had a date after a game, my mother would make up some important reason I had to be home, or, without explanation, change my curfew so that I had to cancel with Tony. When she understood her passive-aggressive tactics weren't working, she made her disapproval as plain as day. "If you even think about getting married before you are of age," she said, "I will absolutely not sign any document giving permission, challenge accepted." I knew I loved Tony and wanted to spend my life with her. But there's nothing like a parent standing in your way to make you even more ardent. We were Romeo and Juliet, minus the double suicide. So with help from Tony's parents, we found out we could get married in the state of Missouri without permission and threatened to do just that. Realizing that stomping her feet and throwing a fit would do nothing but leave her on the outs with me, my mom relented. There was no grand gesture when I proposed. I suggested we stroll downtown to do a little window shopping. We arrived at Bookins, the jewelry store where Ottamuans had purchased their engagement rings for nearly 100 years. And, as casually as I could, despite my nerves, I suggested, "Why don't we go in?" We spent a little time looking at wedding rings until I got a good feel for what she liked. We knew we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together and had discussed it with our parents, but the ring would symbolize putting the plan into action. We were young and didn't know how all the wedding logistics really worked, like obtaining a marriage license, and back then you couldn't just Google it. Not long after, I took Tony to a high school sporting event, after which we grabbed a burger. It was there at the canteen that I asked her to marry me with a ring I had brought at Bookins for $700, which was a fortune for me. Luckily, the store had a long-standing practice of letting customers establish a payment plan with as little as $60 down, which was good for me since I was living on a tight budget. I always made my own money. In high school, I worked first at the McDonald's in town, which was owned by the father of one of my basketball teammates, and then at a grocery store that paid a little better. After 2 years of junior college, I moved to Davenport, Iowa, where I worked in military drafting at Rock Island Arsenal. I lived in a small trailer with a big guy, a shot putter no less, who also worked at the arsenal. We split expenses. My life was working, eating, sleeping, and getting in the car as soon as it was quitting time on Friday to drive back to Ottumwa to spend the weekend with Tony. I drove through some hellish snowstorms just so I could be with her. About 8 months after I proposed, Tony and I were married in a small, simple affair at St. Mary's, followed by a reception in the church basement for which all the guests brought a dish to share. At the time, I was so poor I didn't even own a TV. When I saw one among the wedding gifts, I told my bride, "When we leave tonight, that TV is coming with us." The TV symbolized a new life. No longer was I going to be a bachelor crammed into a bare-bones trailer eating spaghetti elbow-to-elbow with another man. I was going to have a wife and a home where we would sit down to dinner and then get to watch some TV together. I couldn't wait. After our honeymoon, also on a shoestring, it was a 2-hour drive to Des Moines, where we spent one night at a hotel. We settled in Davenport, where I worked, and took classes off and on at the University of Iowa. Even though I had enough credits to qualify as a junior, I decided to put school aside to focus on making a living. Leaving college is one of my biggest regrets. I wanted to be a lawyer and loved studying law, but I knew that going to law school would be a major financial struggle and impossible if we started a family. I made the romantic choice, and it was absolutely the right one. I didn't know it at the time, but I would find fulfillment beyond my wildest dreams. Early in our marriage, I felt fortunate to land a job at a franchise of fast food restaurants called Mr. Quick. The job had management potential, but I had to start behind the counter, which meant was broke. Neither of our families had a lot, so Tony and I knew how to get by. Our efficiency apartment so tiny the living room, kitchen could accommodate only a half-size fridge, and our dining room table unfolded from the wall. I would work from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. during the day and take home 90 cents worth of food for Tony and me to eat for lunch. Then I went back to the restaurant and worked until closing, returning home at midnight. We were always happy when Tony's parents visited, not only because we loved them, but also because they would bring a couple of bags filled with groceries. We had to budget down to our final few dollars to pay our bills, but Tony and I were happy as hell. We didn't have a care in the world because we had each other. From the moment my mother opposed our engagement, insisting it would never work, Tony and I were united in facing any challenge that came our way. Our attitude was, we're going to show you, and we did. Even though we didn't have much, we didn't feel like we lacked anything. The apartment could have been the worst place in the world, and it would have still felt like home because it was ours. We would walk out the front door and simply sit on the communal benches of the apartment complex to watch our neighbors end. Just talk. It was our favorite pastime, and it was free. In the first few years after Tony and I were married, I went from store employee to store manager to regional manager of 5 Mr. Quick locations, and I was grateful to have started on the bare bone stuff. It made managing others much easier. On the personal side, Tony and I became parents with the birth of our daughter Jenny in 1974. We moved from that tiny apartment to what we thought was a palace. Our duplex condo had a kitchen, living room, main bedroom, and very small second bedroom that was Jenny's nursery. Our neighbors on the other side of the duplex became good friends. Every Friday night, we would pool our resources, cooking burgers, brats, or hot dogs that we enjoyed, with a cheap bottle of wine split 4 ways. Good fortune finally smiled on me, even if in a left-handed sort of way, in the winter of 1978. As snowstorms ravaged the Midwest, we took a big risk that would change the trajectory of our family's life. The Great Blizzard of 1978, one of the most severe in U.S. history, all but shut down the economy in the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes, and indeed the entire Midwest for several weeks. The 5 partners who owned the chain of Mr. Quicks I had been working at for 5 years panicked, worrying that the restaurants were going to close like many other small businesses they all owned. Other businesses and worried about the ramifications if the franchise went bankrupt. Knowing this and the inner workings of the franchise, I made an offer to buy them out if they let me acquire the business on contract because I didn't have enough capital to buy it outright. I would be on the hook if Mr. Quick went belly up, so they went for it. According to my calculations, the potential consequences were minimal. I had no savings of any significant amount to lose, and what I did have was boundless energy and the drive to succeed. Tony was 100% behind my decision. There was never a time in our marriage that she did not have faith in me. This was partly because I've always been very responsible. It seems I was born that way, or at least trained from a very young age. The oldest of 4 siblings, I was required by circumstance to be a parent to my brothers and sister because of my mother's alcoholism and mental health issues. Those conditions often required that my mom be institutionalized. Because my father was a baker and left at the crack of dawn for work, I was the one who woke up my siblings for school, gave them breakfast, and made them their lunches. That early imprinting of the vital nature of structure and responsibility never left me. Later in life, long after my mom had passed away, my dad and I took several motorcycle trips together that he still raves about. On the 11-day tour we did of the Smoky Mountains, my dad's driving made me crazy. Although I ride a extremely Harley-Davidson safety conscious. I watch for drivers on cell phones and give them a wide berth. My dad is the polar opposite. Heck, he didn't even use his turn signal. By day 3, I was worried about my mental health. As soon as we rolled into a small mountain town, I took off my helmet angrily and pointed a finger at my father. Dad, the next time you make a turn and don't use your turn signal, I'm leaving you, I said. Lo and behold, we weren't on the road 10 more minutes before he made a left without signaling. I was true to my word. I took off and left his ass. Don't worry, I didn't leave an elderly man on a motorcycle for long, especially since he has this amazing ability to remember directions. I did not share this skill with him and would have been lost without him in more ways than one. Tony knew that I would never do anything intentionally reckless. Although her support for me was unwavering, I asked for her opinions along the way because our strengths and weaknesses complemented one another's. Whereas I was the logical one, Tony had a lot of creative passion. I was the planner, and Tony brought the vibrancy to the plans. We were good with each other. With time, we learned to communicate without needing to talk. Each of us just knew what the other was thinking. When it came to buying that chain of fast food restaurants, I knew before she even said it that she believed in me. Tony always had faith I would do the right thing and come out successful. Now, here's the part of the book where I tell you how to quadruple your money in 9 short years. Easy. Work your ass off. I worked 10-plus hour days, 7 days a week, for months on end to get the business on solid ground. My dad was my role model. When I was a kid, he used to leave the house at 3 every morning to head to the bakery. On weekends, when he returned with a big bag of fresh donuts that he would drop in front of my brother and me as we watched cartoons, he never complained. About toiling in a hot kitchen, it brought him joy to see us fill up on all that sugar and fat. Dad was also ambitious and smart. He went back to school when he was in his mid-30s and, after earning a degree in baking science from the American Bakers Association, became a general manager of large industrial bakeries. In the almost 10 years I owned the business, I made bold real estate moves and bluffed my way into better lease or purchasing terms. I also continued to clean bathrooms. Hoping that each little decision contributes to the likelihood of success, I live by the principle of doing 100 things, 1% better than anyone else, and not looking for the knockout. Win. Oh, and did I mention that I worked my ass off? In the first 7 years after buying out the owners, I worked months without a day off. That meant Tony shouldered most of the burden of parenting Jenny. I even missed her third birthday because of work. Tony and I knew to rely on one another, and I can't imagine a better mother. She was so observant that she saved Jenny's life when we nearly lost her as an infant. Noticing how Jenny kept turning her head in a strange way while she lay in bed, Tony tried to adjust her, and she squealed loudly as if in pain. We got her to the doctor, who diagnosed her with spinal meningitis. Jenny was rushed to the University of Iowa Children's Hospital, where she remained for 6 weeks. I'll never forget that tiny baby, so frail her skin was almost translucent, with 4S in her scalp. We were terrified that we would lose our child. Thank God she survived. The bacterial infection caused Jenny to lose hearing completely in one ear and by about 50% in the other. When she was a toddler, her hearing loss became a bond between the two of us. Doctors had warned us that her hearing could worsen as she grew. To continually test for signs of additional loss, I would learn how to count to 10 in a different language every couple of weeks. French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, it didn't matter as long as the sounds were distinctly different. Then each night, I would give Jenny her bath and see how quickly and accurately she learned the new language. I was always so impressed with her. As she grew up, we made sure she never felt sorry for herself or considered her hearing loss a liability, and we didn't really cut her any slack other than always walking on her left side so she could hear what we were saying. Stereo music is a complete waste on you, I used to tease her. Even today we bust on her from time to time, and I am so proud she's always kept a sense of humor about the situation. Almost losing Jenny, however, did scare me to death, so much that I didn't want to have any more kids. Why risk more potential heartache? But Tony persisted. She had been adopted and had grown up an only child. Speaking from personal experience, Tony implored me to give Jenny a sibling. It took nearly 7 years, but she broke me down. I was doing well enough that we were able to buy our first house, a tiny split-foyer new construction with 3 bedrooms. Tony had been working at a florist shop, a job she loved, but had decided to pursue a more substantial career by taking a job at John Deere Healthcare. At this point in our lives, she knew that we had more to give. I am so thankful she pushed us to grow our family. Angie came along on December 27th in the middle of a horrible snowstorm. I had to tear Tony away from the Bears-Packers football game because apparently I was the only one concerned. We wouldn't make it to the hospital. "Jesus, Tony, do you see the weather out there?" I yelled, but her eyes were glued to the current play. Eventually we made it, but the doctor, who lived in a nearby rural county, was having trouble on the roads. "You might have to help with the delivery," the nurse said to me. I turned to Jelly. I'm horrible with the sight of blood or any kind of human suffering. This couldn't be going worse. Frantic, I reminded Tony that I hadn't wanted a second kid. If I recall correctly, her punch was from the left hand, so I was able to stay on my feet. Luckily, the doctor soon arrived, and all else went smoothly. We really were a very happy, close-knit family. Weekends were family time. We had a small boat that we took out on the Mississippi River, where I taught the girls how to water ski. They would take turns skiing, or I'd throw both in a tube and pull them, laughing in the spray and sun. We'd work up quite an appetite, so we always packed a picnic dinner. Tony tried to balance the PB&Js or cheese and crackers with fresh fruit or veggies. I have to admit, I was no help. I was 100% Team Ritz and peanut butter. While I thoroughly enjoyed coaching the girls' softball teams, Tony was the workhorse at home, juggling our daughters' increasingly complicated schedules and managing the household. She took on more than I did, and she did a good job of it. While our responsibilities became a lot more challenging, our feelings for each other didn't change. As our lives got busier, there were times when Tony and I wished we could have more time together. Occasionally, Tony resented that I had to spend so much time working, but I felt it was my duty, and she ultimately understood. As I pushed forward in my career, the path became less risky and more predictable. Seeing the writing on the wall, or should I say the golden arches on every wall, I decided it was time to say goodbye to Mr. Quick. In 1988, I sold out at a significant profit and took several sales positions until I became the purchasing director at a national food distribution company. Armed with experience in all areas of food distribution, I set my sights on the top spot at a mid-level company in central Illinois where, as president and chief operating officer, I doubled the size of the business in 5 short years before the owners decided to close in 2008. At the ripe old age of 56, I figured it was time to start thinking about retirement. I didn't need to work anymore. I had saved all the profit from the sale of the Mr. Quick franchise and invested every penny of it. Except that I knew I was much too young and energetic to retire completely. I liked golf, but not that much. One Sunday morning, about 8 months after retiring, while reading the paper and having my second cup of coffee, I saw an ad for something called mediation training. The notice in the newspaper was for volunteers interested in becoming civil court mediators. After getting that certification the following year, I embarked on the most varied, enjoyable, and rewarding work of my life. This was an opportunity to give back to the community and a chance to be close to the law, which I had regretted not pursuing when I was younger. The state of Iowa mandates that any small to claims case go to mediation before it goes in front of a judge, so the mediators are a crucial part of the justice system. Whether in small claims court, a workplace conflict, a divorce, or a question of civil rights, I was dedicated to resolving conflicts. I got just as much out of the work as I put into it. Mediation fine tuned a valuable skill, listening. I learned how to listen not only to a person's words, but also to their tone of voice and body language. Meanwhile, Tony had found her own source of rewarding work. She never forgot her first job at the flower shop, which had really touched her heart and soul. Whereas I was the meticulous planner, Tony was more spontaneous. She appreciated art and music and loved any kind of creativity, especially assembling bouquets. However, when it became obvious she wasn't going to be able to contribute enough to the family budget, Tony had sacrificed work she loved to do medical coding with John Deere Healthcare. Day after day, year after year, she did a job she didn't really like because, at that time, we needed her to, but for the last years of her career, she was the volunteer coordinator at a regional hospital, and she set up a florist shop on the premises and trained volunteers in floral design, giving people a place to buy flower arrangements. She ran that shop until her last day of work, May 30th, 2017. She loved the job and came home happy every day. Tony left her job at the hospital reluctantly, but after 2 years of searching, we had finally found our dream retirement home, a lake house in Indiana. You might be wondering how in the world a dedicated Iowa Hawkeye got to the Hoosier State. The answer is simple. Tony and I wanted to be close to family. Jenny was living in Lansing, Michigan, Angie in Fishers, Indiana, and my aging dad in Fort Wayne, Indiana. If you're not from that neck of the woods, all those locations are located along the I-69 corridor through Indiana. We wanted a destination for the entire family that would be good for fun and holiday gatherings. Thus, it was settled. In May 2017, we found our house on Big Long Lake in LaGrange County, a bucolic setting of softly rolling, wooded hills around a pristine 400-acre lake. Best of all, it was near, the midpoint between our daughters and less than an hour from my dad. On June 6, a week after Tony said goodbye to her volunteers at the hospital, we closed on our lake house. Finally, true retirement was upon us. There was so much we were looking forward to, from the big bucket list items, like exotic travel, to everyday pleasures, such as dining out. As a family, we had not eaten in restaurants often. Even when Tony and I had become empty nesters, we still cooked most of our meals. Tony would take 2 nights, I'd take the other 2, and in between it was leftovers, or cereal. Food wasn't the only new indulgence. We were also going to finally be able to give time to our favorite pastimes. When we bought the lake house, Tony got a she shed to return to her creative self. Tony was always taking up new hobbies. She would start about 10 things and finish 1. Now she'd have the space and time to practice all the hobbies she wanted, like jewelry making and scrapbooking. In fact, she had collected a bunch of material from the motorcycle trip my dad and I had taken through the Smoky Mountains, and was going to use that to make her very first scrapbook. Meanwhile, I could finally play a 4 and a half-hour round of golf anytime I wanted to. We spent our first night in our new house before our furniture even arrived. We were so excited for this new beginning that we decided to pack some pillows and blankets and camp out on the floor like a couple of newlyweds. The house, which had started as a fishing cabin 100 years earlier, had been added to over the years. The new primary bedroom suite was on the lower level, but Tony and I chose to put our sleeping bags down in the oldest part of the home. When we woke, we were greeted by the image of the sparkling lake, framed by the huge old growth maple and hickory trees flanking the window. I have to have my coffee every morning, so I had traveled with a coffee maker, and I brewed us a pot. We took our steaming cups and walked with them out the door and toward the water's edge. Tony kicked off her shoes and kept walking right into the water. Still holding her mug, she turned to me, the sun shining from behind her like a halo, and said, This is what lake life is all about. We had looked at a lot of different houses, some of which were fancier or bigger, but all of them had had some kind of obstacle between the house and the water, like a set of steps or a seawall. Until this house. When Tony first saw that you could walk over a few stones and be in the water, she'd said the words that would become our mantra: this is what lake life is all about. The rest of the day was decidedly less romantic. We unloaded our car and then helped the movers, who showed up in a truck with the rest of our stuff. When Tony's back started to hurt several days later, we both thought she just needed to recuperate. She had a history of backaches that began not long after we first met. Usually she'd take a day or two off from work to rest in bed, and then she'd get back on the horse and away she'd go. When she still hadn't bounced back by July 4th, I really began to worry. I had noticed her appetite had fallen off and she was spending more time in bed than out enjoying the lake. The Lake Association does a big fireworks display for Independence Day, and Tony was a big fan of fireworks. Instead of going out in the yard or onto the dock where she would have a better view, she stayed up on the deck of the house where the sight line was limited, but she didn't have to go up and down the steps and so forth. That was the moment that I knew something was definitely wrong. I continued to ask her, "Tony, you okay?" And she continued to answer, "It'll pass in a few days," until I couldn't take it any longer. "Honey, this Saturday, there's a Lake Association meeting," I said. "If you don't feel better, noticeably better, when I come home from that meeting, I'm taking you to the hospital." On Saturday, July 8th, when I returned home from the meeting, I didn't even need to ask her how she was feeling. She was wearing athletic shorts with a drawstring, waistband, and a t-shirt, which was very unusual for her. Tony, who loved to shop, was always dressed. What bothered me the most, and will always bring tears to my eyes, was that she had taken off her wedding ring. She had never taken it off before, and that seemed to be a harbinger of bad things to come. "We have to go to the hospital," I said. She was ready. I drove her to an emergency room about a dozen miles away in Kendallville, Indiana, where, after nearly 5 hours, the doctor said Tony needed to be at Parkview Regional Medical Center, the larger regional hospital in Fort Wayne. Tony never came home. Of a bacterial infection unknown origin had invaded her kidneys. Doctors cycled through her room, where Jenny, Angie, and I were huddled to let us know they were trying this antibiotic, then a new one, and on and on. At one point, I counted 13 containers of antibiotics hanging from her forestand. Nothing seemed able to stop the infection, which quickly moved to her liver. Soon, the bacteria appeared in her lungs as well, and, finally, in her heart. Several surgeries were performed, including one on her heart, but her condition continued to deteriorate. She was placed on dialysis and, at times, needed help breathing. The conversations progressed from hopeful my wife was going to be okay to the point where I realized she wasn't. "You need to consider your options," said the doctors, who didn't go beyond that. The girls and I couldn't bear the idea of having to decide if we should pull the plug. Nothing prepares you for that. I went to the visitor's bathroom on the 5th floor and right there got down on my knees and pleaded with God to give her one more day, just one more day. In my prayers, that day was a lake day when she could proclaim once more, "This is what lake life is all about." I needed guidance. We all liked the heart doctor, who was on the younger side and, from his dress and demeanor, seemed like a bit of a rebel. We asked if we could conference with him about our options, and he agreed. "A DNR, do not resuscitate, sounds like I'm actively causing my wife's death," I said. "Stop thinking about that and start thinking about N," he said. The three of us looked at him, confused. "The A stands for allow, the N for natural, and the D for death," he said. "You aren't doing anything other than letting nature take its course." My daughters and I looked at each other and immediately understood, yes, that was what she would want. After the meeting, the three of us agreed through a lot of tears that we would move forward with a DNR order. Since she'd already had last rites from a priest a day earlier, we felt our duty to protect her soul was complete. All the tubes in 4S were disconnected. Tony wasn't conscious very much, but there were brief moments when she'd open her eyes, and I always ran to her side. "Honey, you've had the last rites. You can let go. We love you very much." It was very weak, but we got a response. She heard us. That was the most difficult part. Otherwise, it was peaceful and brief. Within 3 hours of being taken off life support, she was gone. Tony passed away on July 15th, 2017, 6 weeks after moving to Indiana and only a few months before her 65th birthday. The rest of that summer and fall was a blur. Suddenly, shockingly, out of nowhere, the love of my life, my partner in all things for the last 43 years, was gone. The usual followed, making plans, receiving condolences and calls, the celebration of her life, all of those things. We held the gathering back where she and I had started our life together, Davenport, Iowa. The tremendously long receiving line at the viewing made me proud. A stream of friends, colleagues, and others whose lives she had touched came to pay their respects. Out of all the family and friends in attendance, perhaps the most moving were her volunteers, who all shared variations of the same memory. When Tony taught them how to arrange flowers, how to make something beautiful, she'd always given them the same direction: make a mess, throw the stems on the floor, she said. Don't think about that or anything else that's going on, other than what's in the vase. Go ahead and make a mess. Their words and obvious feelings for my late wife were nice reminders of all the gifts she'd brought to this world in her own special way. But they were also an unbearably painful reminder of all that I had lost. Out of all the life-changing moments I've experienced, and considering I was the central figure of a major reality TV show, I have had a lot of them. Tony's death was by a wide margin. The biggest and most profound. When you lose your partner of 43 years, where do you go? What do you do? In every moment of my life, I had known I had someone to rely on. It was almost an unspoken rhythm. She knew what I needed and what I couldn't get done, and, no words necessary, picked up the slack. I did the same for her. On her volunteer nights, I loaded the car up for her beforehand and made damn sure there was something to eat when she came home. We looked out for each other. There was not a decision or experience in my life that did not have her fingerprints all over it. To make matters worse, I was living in a house that I had only been in for a month, in a place, with no friends or community. I didn't know who my neighbors were. Hell, I didn't even know where to go for groceries. I was completely lost. After she was gone, my heart was lifted by an act of kindness offered by my oldest granddaughter. Peyton was only 16 at the time, but she decided that she wasn't going home to Lansing during her summer break from school, that I needed someone else in the house. I'm not going to do much cooking, and there might not be much to occupy your time, I warned her. I will just be here for you to talk to if you want, Peyton said. Yes, I was lonely. Well, loneliness I hadn't even known existed, let alone thought I'd ever experience. In those first few years after Tony's death, however, the emotion that tortured me even more than loneliness was guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was, in some way, responsible for her early death. Tony was a trooper to a fault. No matter what, she never complained, not when she spent her life in a career she didn't like, so we could work toward the retirement I envisioned for us, not when she was in labor with our first daughter, and I failed to understand the urgency of the situation. The day Jenny was born, I called Tony from work to tell her not to worry if I was a little later than normal. I'm going to look for golf clubs on my way home. And that's exactly what I did. When I got home, boy, was I in for a big shock. Tony, whose water had broken, was waiting for me at the door. I've got to go to the hospital, she said. It was a bit of a tense moment, to put it mildly, but we got there real quick. I couldn't believe that my wife had been suffering alone at home, waiting for me to arrive, while I was making progress on my new hobby. When I spoke to her on the phone, Tony hadn't given me any indication she was in labor. I knew this about her. I knew her better than anyone else. So why didn't I insist she get to a doctor earlier when she wasn't feeling well? Why did I have her help me with the move in the first place, considering her bad back? But the worst questions and self-doubt came with a shocking and horrible discovery I made after Tony's death. When I started to go through her things in the house, I began in the bathroom, thinking toiletries and medications would be easier to clear out than clothes and other items I more closely associated with her. Tucked away in the back of a bathroom drawer, in a clear sign that she didn't want anybody to uncover what was in there, I found evidence that she had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. There was literature, prescriptions, a blood glucose meter, and other supplies, all apparently untouched and unused. She'd never mentioned this big diagnosis to me or her daughters, and, as far as I could tell, she'd never followed through with treatment. My mind reeled with what ifs. Untreated or unmanaged diabetes stresses the body, particularly the kidneys. Had Tony had the means to live longer, but been undone in the end by the belief that any kind of whining was frivolous? Had I somehow contributed to this mentality? Why hadn't she felt comfortable confiding in me about something as important as having diabetes? The loss of any loved one is sad. But to think it might have been possible, no matter how remotely, for her to have lived longer or still be alive today is even more painful. Saddest of all is that Tony didn't feel safe enough to tell anyone the truth of what was happening with her. When I shared this discovery with my daughters, they were as shocked as I was, if not more. Tony had always been comfortable confiding in the girls. Regret tortured me whenever I looked out the window at the lake. The water's serene beauty taunted me in an everyday reminder that Tony had been robbed. There was an overriding thought I repeated to myself so much that sometimes I would even say it out loud, even though there was no one else to hear it. This lake house is Tony's dream, I cried. This is what she wanted, and she got cheated. Tony and I had very different approaches to money, and that difference caused stress in our marriage at times. She lived for today and believed in spending. Now, as opposed to saving and waiting for the payoff. I was frugal, but I was looking at the long term. We're going to save our money because we're going to live it up when we're retired, I told her, and she listened. Tony paid her dues right along with me, building a nice nest egg so we could live it up. And then she didn't get the opportunity to enjoy it. To this day, I feel guilty that I am living our dream, but she was denied that pleasure. Now, 2+ years after Tony's death, Angie and Jenny were egging me on to apply to a dating show. After that episode of The Bachelorette was over and I had showered and gotten into bed, I lay there thinking about the absurdity of life. I, a man who'd married his high school sweetheart, couldn't picture myself on TV, let alone romancing a bevy of women. But I also had never imagined that Tony would die so young and leave me so alone. I got up the next morning, fired up the computer, and filled out the application.